Hello, welcome to the IndyStars from Way Downtown Pacers podcast. I am Pacers editor Nat Newell here with our insider Dustin Dopirak. Been a busy week. I don't know that anything that's happened or is going to happen will have an enormous impact on the team if things go as we expect. But hey, we can always be wrong and hope that they do something crazy. So uh, we'll start with the draft. No first round pick. Um, and they sort of went against the grain of what we thought they might do with their first pick. But just give us your quick thoughts on how the draft went for the Pacers.
I think they did in the sense that I just didn't think Johnny Furphy was going to be on the board.
Right.
That just wasn't. It seemed like they. Obviously they were doing their due diligence, and this is certainly a testament to that you have to be ready for what shows up, and basically have to decide whether if somebody slips, they're worth what you want. They obviously prepped as if. Hey, we're probably going to be looking at a bunch of 4 and 5 year guys, that don't necessarily have high ceilings, but maybe have high floors. Let's go after competitive guys that we can trust, high basketball IQ, a lot of experience, that have done some winning, that have accomplished some things, and sort of see who fits out of that group. But Furphy slipped to them. Obviously, was a guy that was in the green room that everybody expected to be a top 25 pick for the most part. And they had done enough due diligence to say, you know what, he does fit what we want. I mean, he's probably not going to be able to play immediately, but he's a guy that has the sort of upside that fits. I mean, I thought a few things that were interesting that Chad Buchanan mentioned, but I think you could also see, looking at kind of his highlights and his shot profile, he's a guy that moves without the ball pretty well. I think I checked out, there's a site called hoopmath.com that sort of like kind of breaks down, by it's not super detailed, but it's basically like, would you shoot at the rim? Would you shoot from mid range? Would you shoot from three? And he made about 80% of his shots at the rim, and 75% of those were assisted. So what that tells you, obviously, is he's moving without the ball. It's not a scenario where he's getting to the rim off the bounce a whole lot, but he's moving in such a way that guys can find him for easy buckets. And obviously that meant he was playing with a group of pretty established guys at Kansas. I mean, he certainly wasn't the top option when you talk about, Hunter Dickinson and Kevin McCullough and it's a DeJuan Harris, and there's a guy I'm forgetting, but some really talented guys over at Kansas, and he was a priority as kind of a blue chip freshman, but not the guy. And so he learned to kind of play within that system, get his shots where they came to him, and just had a pretty productive offensive season. Was all Big 12 all rookie, or Big 12 all rookie. And so, I think Chad mentioned he sees a really good fit there in terms of how he's able to move without the ball, likes how he offensive rebounds also. Talented kid, 6'9", obviously has to put some muscle on. I think Chad did a pretty good job of sort of keeping expectations low in terms of how much he's going to play. Obviously, they had a hard time getting a lottery pick, any minutes last year. So certainly the guy who's picked at 36 is not going to have a clear shot to anything, but seemed to make it pretty clear that, hey, this is a guy that's going to be developmental, probably not going to get a whole bunch of minutes, probably. He didn't say it, but the indication, I think, was pretty clear that he's going to get some Mad Ants time. Whether he's going to get a two-way contract or not, it sounds like he wouldn't. It sounds like he's going to get a full-time deal, but simply be asked to spend some time with the Mad Ants. But it seems like that's where he's going to get a lot of minutes and a lot of development time this year. As far as beyond that, Tristen Newton and Enrique Freeman, those guys obviously sort of fit what you thought they were looking for. Both of those are 5-year guys. Obviously, Tristen Newton was most outstanding player at the tournament. He was the first team All-American. Again, not a super high ceiling guy, doesn't shoot the ball super well. Athleticism is just okay, but is a winner. Obviously, Tristen Newton does just so many little things well for that Connecticut team that won the championship, and you just imagine he's going to be a Rick Carlisle guy. Just on the basis of what he was able to do for them. He just seems like the sort of guy that Rick's going to be super thrilled about. His ability to defend, create, rebound for guard, play bigger than he is going to be helpful. And obviously, I think when you're looking for somebody who's not going to get a clear spot to a rotation, he's a guy that can play 2-3 positions. He can really play anywhere from 1 to 3 if you need him in a pinch. And so I don't know that he's going to have much of an opportunity to even compete for a rotation spot, but someone's going to get hurt for at least a little bit. Even if they're really lucky, as far as injuries are concerned this year, you're going to have, guys get an ankle tweak, guys get sick for a few games. That stuff happens over the course of the season, and having a guy like Newton who can step in at a bunch of positions behind them is really, really helpful. Freeman's obviously an interesting story, a guy who, you can't even call him a walk-on because, it's not like he was a preferred walk-on. Like, he went to campus, somebody had to tell him, hey, you should probably try out. And he made the team that way and ended up being 3-time All-MAC, 4-time MAC All-Defense, MAC Player of the Year, and the nation's leading rebounder this year. So you had to think there's a spot for him if Jalen Smith does, in fact, decline his player option. That's been reported, but we haven't been able to confirm that at this point. If Smith does ultimately move on, there is some space behind Isaiah Jackson, who's obviously foul prone, to get some minutes at the 5. So I guess those 2 picks weren't surprising in and of themselves, but it was a little bit surprising that they made 3 picks, that they ultimately didn't try to either trade one of those away, sell them, or go get somebody from overseas that you could stash someplace. All of these guys, are American college players. It's not as easy to ship them somewhere. And so ultimately these are guys they're going to have to find roster space for between the main roster and the 2-ways. And so, I was a little bit surprised that they filled all those spots. But they did fill all those spots with guys that could help them.
Yeah, the one thing I always think about during the draft process is when you look at the probabilities outside the top 10, everything is a coin flip. Second round picks in the last 10 years, the 2 best players picked at 36 are Herb Jones and Xavier Tillman. Herb Jones, obviously a very useful NBA player. Xavier Tillman, a useful NBA player. Right. Now, I'm also cherry picking my 10 years there because 11 years ago, Draymond Green was taken with that pick. But basically, there's a 20% chance that these guys amount to anything. And then on top of that, what's the odds that they amount to something with the team that drafted them? So I think people get all excited about this, and thank God they do, because then they come to us and they read the story. So we like that.
Exactly.
But the idea that these guys are going to have an impact, is a long shot. The other interesting thing to me is Antonio Davis was obviously a great second-round pick by the Pacers 100 years ago. I'm not sure before Andrew Nembhard they had another second-round pick amount to anything. I did some research on this a while back, and I can't remember it all now, but I remember them being one of the worst franchises when it came to capitalizing on second-round picks. You did a story on how they ended up with Nembhard, and it seemed like they sort of revamped everything they're doing, and maybe they have a better idea of how to find players in the second round. I'm certainly not saying these 3 players will not amount to anything. The odds say they won't, but that's but then you get a surprise, and that's great. I thought it was interesting that they brought Furphy in without having seen him at all. At the same time, I'm sure if they reached out to him, he probably would have turned them down because he didn't expect to go that low. So that's not criticism of the Pacers for not having seen him. It's just interesting that they would do that. And as you said, they certainly had plenty of they did their due diligence. And heck, I just got done saying second round picks aren't always worth that much. If you think there's a chance that you get a guy who's a top 25 pick at 36, then what's the risk? You take him and you go from there. I think Newton's interesting because I thought they could have used a point guard. When Jarris Walker is playing point guard for you in garbage time, you probably need a 4th guy. They didn't want to play Isaiah Wong in that spot for some reason. I'm not sure why. And then Freeman's a great story. Greg Doyle, our columnist, has a great story on him. Currently posted on IndyStar.com about how there's a Pacers tie is the reason that he is now in the NBA. So that's definitely worth reading. But yeah, he grew 4 inches late, and the coaching staff at Akron had to beg him to come try out for the team. Yeah. So as you said, this is not like your typical. This is a true walk on, as in he wasn't there to play basketball, and they said, hey, why don't you give it a try?
Yeah.
So I think you got to be. Again, Furphy also, it seems like, fits the he's an athletic guy, as you noted, versatile offensively. So it seems like he could fit. But But if any of these three guys is playing significant minutes, something probably went wrong for the Pacers
this year. Yes, this year certainly. I mean, I think to your point, like second round, who makes it, who doesn't. It's just so much about opportunity. And a lot of these cases, you don't even really want to bring your second round pick on. Like you don't even have roster space. And obviously last year, the Pacers had to trade down. Kevin Pritchard told us way back in January, like pretty much unprompted, right after the Miles Turner signing, we were just kind of, doing some sort of state of the union discussion with him. And they had 5 picks at the time. He's like, well, you can't pick 5 guys. Like, we're not going to pick 5 guys. And I don't know if he laid too many cards out on the table at that point and made it harder to move. But ultimately, I mean, they did some trading back, and they picked Mojave King at 40. And I don't know where Mojave King is. He came back. He was on the Mad Ants roster for a little bit, so I know he was in town. So I don't know what his next place is, but obviously he was taken. He had a pretty good combine. Did some good testing up there. I think they liked some things that he did at his workout. But ultimately, he was taking over some other guys because they knew they didn't actually have to bring him. Basically they could find some other place to put him without using, one of the 2-way contracts, and without, actually putting him on the roster. So, that's a lot of time what you run into with second round guys is you just never really get a chance. So maybe based on how they're being picked, the scenario they're in, maybe they get a better opportunity. Certainly, in Newton's case, just his versatility, might give him a chance, if there's an injury, if for whatever reason they part ways, with one of those guards, there could be an opportunity for him to step up. Maybe if there's minutes at the 5 for Enrique Freeman, maybe he has to step in there and do something. I feel like there's probably a lot of these guys that can do a job. They get picked in the second round that just never get a chance because there's just not the opportunity for them. Obviously, you saw last season, local tie, Trayce Jackson-Davis, there was a spot for him on the Warriors, and he made a huge impact. So, I mean, he's practically, they treated him like a first-round pick. And so he got an opportunity, and, he'll stick for at least a while. Maybe they'll eventually draft over him. But, next season and the immediate seasons going forward, he's going to be a rotation guy for them. So, you obviously can find very accomplished guys. I thought it was something Brad Stevens pointed out in his press. He had a press conference earlier this week when he was talking about how there are guys who aren't in certain drafts because they're sticking around for the NIL money. I mean, you're ultimately getting more than a 2-way to stay in school. But what that means is then the next year those guys are available, and ultimately you're the guys that are around in the second round are a more experienced group, guys that have won, guys that ultimately said, okay, I could leave now and go in the second round and get a 2-way contract and just get out of here and start making money. Or like now I can keep making money in college, and they're more game ready, when they come out, for 4 years, 4 years in, might give them a better chance to stick long-term. So we'll see how that goes. If that ultimately changes the level of success that you get out of second round picks, and it's altogether possible that you do.
It's always fascinated me in that I believe there is 20, 25 guys, I'm just making the number up, whatever it is, who are basically indistinguishable from one another. These are people who are paid, the scouts, the teams are paid to know who can play and who can't. And out of that group of whatever it is, 20, 25, whatever, one of them is going to end up being a really good NBA player. There's probably 2 or 3 more that'll have an NBA career. There's probably a handful more that will have pro careers. And nobody knows. They literally can bring them in and say, do exactly this, and still nobody knows who those guys are going to be. It's always fascinated me about just how narrow the margins. And it's somewhat true. It's like with Trayce Jackson-Davis, you got to get in the right spot. If he goes to another team, maybe he's, maybe he's not looking like a NBA, a solid NBA player, someone who's got he's going to have to scrap and claw and scratch to get a spot. He doesn't have to do that. So it's always fascinated me about that.
It's an opportunity league. It really is. I think even I was talking to John Halliburton about just stuff in general. He said, it's an opportunity league. And it's just, there are like some guys who never get a shot, that can hang athletically, physically, all those kinds of things. It's just opportunity. When you get past, there's a certain amount of guys that obviously we're going to get their opportunity no matter what, that are going to be stars, that are that higher echelon. But kind of in the middle there, in terms of who gets to be a really good role player, or who gets to stick as, maybe a second unit point guard, like a lot of guys can do it. It's just like who gets a shot and who gets an opportunity to really develop, and who doesn't. And just so much of it is about opportunity, like getting on a team that needs you, getting on a team that is bad enough to let you develop, or any number of those things. You just never know what ultimately leads, when you look at that kind of big mass in terms of median NBA talent, the difference between who makes it and who doesn't. Sometimes it isn't even up to the guy. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So, but it's a lot about opportunity and chance.
You mentioned Jalen Smith. We'll touch base on him as a lead into free agency. Michael Scotto, who works for Hoops Hype, which is also owned by Gannett, as is IndyStar, is reporting that he is going to decline the Pacers option. You've not been able to confirm that yet.
Nope.
It doesn't mean it's doesn't mean it's not true. It's probably true, almost certainly. But that's where we're at with that. If he does decline the option, I think that's what's best for the Pacers. I think it's also what's best for Jalen Smith. But what are your thoughts on what's next with Jalen Smith, since he's the
right?
Next,
That's
to fall.
Sure. Yeah. No, again, that's really up in the air. Like, this isn't one where, like, obviously certain guys report it, it's, and I'm not casting aspersions certainly on Michael Scotto, but like there are, in some cases you could say, well, that must be the case, but don't know, just talking to sources, don't have anything confirmed on that. No, like, people that have gotten back to me have not been able to confirm it. So kind of waiting, wait to see on that one. But yeah, obviously after the playoffs, he didn't get a lot of playing time. He's certainly been locked into this back and forth with Isaiah Jackson for most of the last 2 seasons at the 5. Obviously he's had a few opportunities at the 4, was, anointed starting power forward going in to last season after he signed his 3-year extension with this player option. And then this year, when they kind of decided to really focus more on defense, he moved from backup center to power forward, as they were kind of putting some emphasis on having size in the starting lineup. And then when they acquired Pascal Siakam, he was back to the bench. So, he had ultimately a really efficient year. I mean, he shot a touch under 60% from the field, 42.4% from 3, even though he kind of dragged toward the end of the year. He was absurdly on fire to start the beginning of the season. Obviously wasn't shooting at high volumes, but was at like 70% in like December or early January, if I recall correctly. And but just for whatever reason, just didn't get much done in the playoffs, especially game 1 against the Bucks. He was like minus 13 in 13 minutes, just wasn't doing a lot right, and then didn't get a lot of opportunities after that. They went more with Isaiah Jackson for kind of the energy. Obviously, you've seen Smith be able to rebound and shoot the ball. He's the more skilled option between Smith and Jackson, but Jackson has the more raw athleticism. Obviously, he's getting up there and finishing, finishing lobs, blocking shots. They both grab rebounds pretty well, for backup 5s. But, just for whatever reason, Jackson showed a lot more in the playoffs. And so you'd have to think he's kind of ahead of the game, going into next season, if they were going to both be there. And if you're Jalen Smith, you have to look around and say, well, there's got to be a better option. There's got to be a place where I've got a cleaner path to being a backup center and having those minutes, regularly. So you could obviously see a lot of reason why he'd want to walk. And kind of test the waters elsewhere. I imagine there's a lot of people that are willing to pay 7 or 8 figures a year to get somebody like Jalen Smith as their backup center, and even a handful of places that wouldn't mind having him as a starter. Probably not as many of those, but you'd have to think there's more of a place for him in a place where he'd get paid better. So it would be the sensible option if he does it. Again, don't know for sure that he has.
Yeah, you got to think. I think it was $5.4 million, something like that. That was the player option for the Pacers. Even if he's giving away a little bit of that money for a chance to get, to know he's going to play, you got to. I get it. You got to understand why he might do that. And as you know, he could easily be getting more than his player option. And just to be clear, the Pacers would be better with Jalen Smith because he's a talented player. Right. If he's your third string center, you're in a pretty good spot at center with that.
Sure.
But they probably could use the 5.4 million and the roster spot somewhere else more than that, because Isaiah Jackson has proven that he can play it. And then even beyond Isaiah Jackson, you've got Shibwe, you've got you just took Enrique Freeman, who's undersized, but he can play center. Obi Toppin showed that he can play center. He's a restricted free agent. You assume he's coming back. We don't know that for sure. He can play center. Even Siakam can play some small lineup center. It just seems like, in terms of the resources, Jalen Smith, the Pacers are better without him than with him. But again, that's no reflection on him as a player. You posted a story today on free agents the Pacers could target. We were texting about this, in which I don't think if I'm a free agent, I don't know who has been an NBA regular, I don't know that I would come to the Pacers without a serious, without getting more money than I can get anywhere else, just because I don't think there's a lot of playing time. But just sort of, but then the flip side is, do we want to put out a list of possible free agents with 5 names nobody's ever heard of before? So what do you think is realistic for the Pacers in free agency this season?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, just to go over their cap situation, they're over the cap even before you get into Obi Toppin and Jalen Smith, obviously, because, Tyrese Halliburton's, mega max contract kicks in. Siakam obviously, intends to sign his. So both of those guys will be making 30% of the cap, which is $42.3 million each. So I think that puts them at 84.6 between the two of them. And so again, that's 60% of the way to 141, which is the salary cap. So then you've got Miles Turner, a tick under 20. You've got Aaron Nesmith's 3-year contract extension kicks in at 11. McConnell, if he's fully guaranteed, which I think will presumably happen today. I think if he's still on the roster after today, I think that automatically kicks. And obviously there's a possibility that he signs something more lucrative, more of an extension there. Then that, adds on a little bit more than that. I mean, he would be at 9.3 even if, and then you tack on just sort of all the rookie scales, obviously Benedict Mathurin's and Jarris Walker's are high because they were top 10 picks. Still have Andrew Nembhard in there. I'm trying to think, obviously Isaiah Jackson somewhere around 4.4. So you tack all those together, it's about 149 before you even get into Obi Toppin and Jalen Smith. So what that means is you can't just sign somebody for anything. They qualify for the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So that doesn't count against them in the cap. And they can pay somebody up to $12.8 million a year, 12.8 something. There's a few other numbers, within those commas there. And so they can go at somebody at a mid-level, rotation fringe starter caliber guy, more or less. And you're obviously you can't really swing big in that case. But there's a handful of guys that are worth looking at. Again, they don't have clear paths. To your point, to a starting job. I mean, they can beat somebody out. Obviously, what you're, really, if you're a wing, you're saying I'm signing on and trusting myself that I can beat out Ben Shepherd. And that's not a sure thing at all. But there's certain guys you have to look at yourself and say, well, I trust myself to win that job. I looked the guys that I mentioned. The 5 players that I mentioned were DeAnthony Melton, Gordon Hayward, Royce O'Neal, Eric Gordon, and Malik Beasley. And so any of those guys, and obviously don't know who's going to, Gordon Hayward's obviously going to have to take a massive pay cut, but I think he knows he does after what happened in Oklahoma City. I mean, he just barely played in the playoffs at all. He took, I think, 3 shots in the entirety of the postseason, and that's a guy that was getting paid $33 million. I think he's fully aware that he's not getting $33 million from anybody. But, he's obviously a local guy. You could see an opportunity to bring in another big wing. That certainly seems to be what everybody wants, even though, again, Aaron Nesmith is still on the team. Benedict Mathurin's still on the team. If they bring back Obi Toppin, he's still on the team, and Jarris Walker also. But he'd be an option. Royce O'Neal obviously is a reliable defender. Malik Beasley is a movement shooter, and they could maybe use that after having traded away Buddy Hield. Those guys do have a chance to play themselves into a bunch of those guys can beat out Ben Shepherd. or at least should have a chance, at least should be looked at, and given the opportunity to do so. And so no guarantee that they're going to try to do that, or the Pacers even want to put somebody in the position to try to do that. But if they do, you could see why somebody would say, okay, I trust myself enough to win that job, and I will take $12 million to do it. I could see them looking into guys at that caliber and picking somebody out. Doesn't mean that they definitely will. And again, Chad Buchanan has given a lot of indication that he's willing to run it back with this group. But those would be some options, some avenues they could take. And there's others, certainly. And if Jalen declines this player option, then there could be some other fives you could look at. There's not as many of those, I don't think. But they can look in a bunch of different directions in that case. With that level of flexibility, they don't have a lot, but they do have that.
Yeah, just to go over it real quick, obviously, Halliburton, McConnell, Nebhard are point guards. Obviously, Nebhard plays a lot of two guard, if there is such a thing anymore. Shepard, Matherin, Naismith are their wings. Siakam, Toppin, Turner, Jackson. That's 10 players right there. That doesn't include Jarris Walker. Now we're at 11. No one's playing 11 guys. So anyone you bring in, would – again, there could be an injury, there could be any number of things.
Sure.
But it just doesn't if I'm a free agent, I'm looking at that roster and not thinking, who am I beating out from this team that just made the Eastern Conference Finals? All that being said, of the guys that you listed, anyone in particular you really like more than the others, or think fits best, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, Melton and O'Neal, I think, are two of the ones that I find the most interesting. I think Melton's a guy who plays a little bit bigger, is a kind of pretty trustworthy defender because he's got a 6'8.5" wingspan, so he can get out there and guard twos and threes, and you like him on the ball. And he's a pretty good, catch and shoot guy. You've seen him kind of burn the Pacers on a couple of occasions when he's been able to, certainly in that case, there's a lot of gravity on that team between Maxey and Embiid, but he's been able to kind of, sit out there and be one of those guys that Embiid finds for three. But obviously he had some issues he was going through. There was a reason why they still felt the need to require Buddy Hield. So he's a nice player, but just in terms of making up for the 3-pointers lost in that deal, you can't expect for him to step in and be what Buddy was. O'Neal just gives you some grit, some toughness. Just have another guy out there that's a wing defender option. That's a little bit in the Naismith mold. Naismith's got a little bit more upside. I think a little bit more ability to get to the rim. Might be a touch better. Naismith, I think, has more capacity to be a good shooter. Obviously, O'Neal, I think, is 31, I want to say. And so I think Naismith has some room to grow as an offensive player, and O'Neal probably is what he is. But, the grit, the muscle, that's still nice to have, as much as, again, this is still not a very good defensive team. And so even though there's not necessarily a clear place for him to plug and play, just adding options, adding guys that can be defensive weapons, is not necessarily a bad idea. And if they play their way into a rotation spot, they play their way into a rotation spot. So I think, those guys would be worth looking at. It does seem like O'Neal might sign an extension with the Suns, so that he might not be easy to pry away. Those are numbers that stood out at me. They get Eric Gordon for cheap. I don't know they need him necessarily, but obviously an Indiana guy. It's still scoring. He's never, he's been in the league, I think, 16 years, and he's averaged double figures every year, and he hits threes, so can't rule him out. Beasley's not as good of a defender, but if they feel like they really needed a gravity movement 3-point shooter, he's not a bad place to look either. So all those guys are options. Again, I'm sure there's tons more than I'm not thinking of. There's probably some people that might be more willing to take a pay cut than I'm considering, like a Gary Trent or somebody like that. But again, they're not necessarily. They're not exactly necessary for the Pacers to go get.
Yeah, the only thing I thought that they might want is some kind of younger shooter who's got other issues, but I don't know that guy. Looking at the free agent list, I don't think that guy exists. And probably because if you were younger and maybe a shooter, you're not going to become a free agent. Someone's going to re-sign you. But
right, Luke Kennard is a guy that's got a team option, and apparently that's a big question mark over in Memphis as to whether or not they're going to keep him. I don't know if he's making right around $14.1 million, so he probably is going to, if he's let go, maybe he takes a step back, but that's no guarantee either. A pretty reliable three-point shooter there. So, it's a little bit on the younger side. But again, no guarantee you're going to be able to keep him under that mid-level exception.
The other big news was the Knicks trade, getting Mikal Bridges for 5 first-round draft picks. They also re-signed OG Anunoby at an enormous sum of money for a guy who only plays 50 games a year. Obviously, the Knicks are way better. I think you would say the Knicks are better than the Pacers now. I'll be right up front with that in terms of everything else I'm going to say, which is more not critical, but more looking at this sort of devil's advocate ways.
Sure.
At the same time, I don't know that I'm as excited about this from the Knicks standpoint as a lot of people are. Number one, you're going to have DiVincenzo and Josh Hart coming off the bench. I'm kind of curious how that goes after they were playing 50 minutes of 48-minute games at the end of last season. You have other than Mitchell Robinson, who's also injury prone, you have no size, which I think, or I shouldn't say no size. You're going to lose Hartenstein because you can't afford him anymore. They don't have a clear big guy, productive big guy after Mitchell Robinson, which could be an issue. But you got to love.
Julius Randle is still on that team.
Yeah, and is he a bit? I mean, I'm thinking more of a center. He's more of a forward. I almost mentioned that, but yeah, certainly he's a guy in the middle. But where do you put them? Obviously, they've added a significant amount of talent, and you got to worry about that. I mean, do you think they're the second best team in the East? And just where do you think they rank or the Pacers rank compared to the Knicks at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to say they are on paper, just because, again, like they got to the Pacers, got the Pacers to a Game 7 with, basically without Anunoby for most of that series, after Game 2, without Randall entirely. They had lost Bogdanovich at that point, and so you almost have to, on paper, you almost have to say that they are. And, they still have some other pieces I really like, Miles McBride, and maybe Hart, when you got Hart or DiVincenzo coming off the bench, you're like, that's really something.
The bench is a lot better. Will Thibodeau play it? Is another question.
Maybe they'll play it. Yeah, maybe they won't. I mean, maybe
he just plays the 5 best guys he's got, and it doesn't matter who they are and who's on the bench.
Exactly. And so if they would have let Alec Burks actually play, maybe they wouldn't have found themselves in that position.
Yeah,
because he's not bad. There's a couple guys who are like,
weird.
You could have,
get enough talk. There wasn't enough talk about that, in my opinion. The other thing, going to what you say, if Nembhard does not make a crazy shot at the end of Game 3, the Pacers don't win that series. That literally came down to that shot. I mean, obviously, it comes down to a million things, but he doesn't make that shot, they don't win because they're down 3-0, and they're not, even with everything the Knicks went through, they're not coming back from 3-0. So
no, it was a massive shot. It was such a giant shot in a bad situation because, Halliburton was cooked, and he was just like, "Oh my God, just do something, Drew," and he did it. I mean, he just drilled one. I think you have to say on paper that that they look better than the Pacers, but again, the Pacers got to the Eastern Conference Finals, and they do have an addition as well. With Benedict Mathurin coming back, and you don't know, I was a little bit surprised for Buchanan to still volunteer the idea. I thought when he was asked if you're willing to run it back, that was kind of his way of just saying, yeah, sure, in a way of saying anything could happen. I'm committing nothing in any way, shape, or form when he said it the first time. This time he volunteered it. So it is more of a driving force for their way of looking at this than I thought. It seemed to me more like, we're comfortable with that, but we're also looking around. We're checking to see what's available. We're making calls. We're, if something, falls in our lap, we're going to do it. So I expected maybe a little bit more of him to say, or at least indicate that there was a sense that the ante had been upped a little bit when again, just the Knicks becoming a more talented team, and also doing it in a way that showed that they know how Boston won. Basically to say, all right, you need to be wing heavy, and you have to have their wings to counter their wings. Basically to have guys, really two-way guys that you can imagine them, matching up against what Boston has. You kind of have to set Boston as the gold standard and say, okay, well, what are you going to do to beat them? Just think about them, and then everybody else will come into place. But you're not getting to the finals if you don't beat them. So what do you have to do to make that happen? So I thought that was interesting on the Knicks part, but then the Pacers looking at it and saying, they haven't at least vocally come out and said, okay, well, that means we have to go do this. But again, at the same time, like the Pacers aren't out of that discussion. Like that doesn't mean that the Pacers now cannot beat the Knicks in a best of 7 series. They ran it back. With the Pacers healthy, with their guys back, and with the Knicks guys back, that doesn't mean they can't beat them. It doesn't mean they can't beat them in a regular season game. That doesn't mean they can't beat them in the best of 7 series. But if you're just looking at, who's got more depth of talent on paper right now, I think you do have to go with the Knicks by a little bit anyway. And you still have Milwaukee to worry about. They're still gonna have Giannis. You imagine basically, like Philly is like the great unknown. You just have to imagine them just completely resetting themselves, knowing that they'll have, Maxey and Embiid as cornerstones. But we could be talking a week from now and looking at a totally different form of Philadelphia. Maybe they get a Paul George, maybe they get somebody else on a max deal. And you end up getting 3 max contracts. And it's not going to be a whole lot of flexibility, but, you might end up having that. You don't know what they're going to be with the rest of their pieces, what they're going to ultimately let walk and what they're not. But there's a lot of space there for the 76ers to invent themselves, and we'll see how they do it. And, again, like we're going to be considering Philadelphia in a totally different way a week from now than we do right now.
Well, interesting fact, if the season started today, Philadelphia would be in a lot of trouble because they only have 3 players. And
what's that?
I think it's hard to win. The track record of teams with 3 players in the NBA and no more is not good at all. Legitimately, right? They could threaten despite as great as Maxey and Embiid are. I think that would they win 10 games with only 3 players? Probably not.
You never know. Check stat hit on that. I'd like to see a printout. That's a reference as to how 3-man teams have done in the 5-man NBA.
The other thing that this is, Zach Lowe has mentioned this at ESPN. I think Brian Windhorst hinted at it on the Pat McAfee show the other day. The big thing to me is like the Pacers aren't really getting where they need they're not quote unquote catching up to the Knicks or Celtics or whoever in free agency. They're not doing it with 2nd round picks. It's going to be some kind, if they're going to do that, it would be some kind of trade. And we touched on this last podcast. They have the pieces to do it. If Mathurin is not the guy that you need him to be, he is a guy that you can build a trade around. And they've got plenty of other pieces. Walker's a guy. I don't want to see him trade Walker, but they could. But Toppin, you could trade, if you re-sign Toppin, he'd be an interesting trade piece. I think they're just being really smart about this and saying, we can go the best option right now, just because the avenues to improving themselves right now aren't, it's just, there's not a lot of bang for your buck on that. You start the season, you let things play out for a bit, and you see, because even look back at last season, they were a really different team at the end than they were at the beginning, and they were a better team than they were at the beginning. Now, again, injuries happen. Maybe it hits the Pacers this time, whatever, but it just seems like they're handling this. It just seems like they're handling this the right way in terms of just, hey, we don't need to make every decision right now, even though every fan base wants that to be the case. Heck, we would love it if they'd make some big move because it's a slow time and then we'd have something to write about that people would want to read about. But that's not the way they should go. They have the pieces to see how this plays out. And in fact, it's probably not the smartest thing to do unless you get overwhelmed with an offer right now. They do have this, the team building does not end with free agency.
No. I think, just the first 2 guys you mentioned are really the big key there is Walker and Mathurin and saying, what do you really have? And like getting a real sense of it. Like, what do you think they can become? And are they, are you better keeping them? Or are you better moving them? I think they're valuable pieces either way. I think they're going to be in a scenario where mid to end of this year, they'll still be valuable assets in terms of if you want to move them. Obviously, like with Mathurin, it's not a case of can he play. It's a case of can he fit. Like, he can play. He can score, he has the athleticism, he has the body, he's got to defend better, but ultimately, like, you don't look at him and say, okay, well, there's just a physical deficiency that he's never going to, make up for. Again, like defensive instincts need to be better, but this guy can put the ball in the bucket. He's a really good athlete. And so, again, it's a question of, does he fit the way that these guys work? Do you have to put, to really get the most out of him, do you have to put him in a position where he gets to ISO more and he gets to take the ball himself a lot more, and just really have the ball in his hands and be more of a driving force? Can he ever really be what he can be if, you have Halliburton driving the train and the ball just finds him? Finds Mathurin from time to time? Is that, can you maximize his talent or not in that scenario? And if you can't, do you have a better chance of prying something away from somebody that would make you a lot better, maybe make them a lot better? That's a possibility. I think they still have to play that out. I think a lot of people might feel like the answer is clear at this point. Not quite there yet. I just think he's just too talented a guy. It'd just be really hard for me to walk away from Benedict Mathurin.
To be clear, my point is not that we know whether Mathurin is that guy or not. That exactly what you said. He could be that guy, and they're going to find out. And if he's not that guy, then it's, again, like you say, he's still a talent. Whatever else you want to say about him, yes, he's got deficiencies, but in a league where give a guy the ball and let him go get a basket is an important skill. He's that guy, and they don't have another guy like that. Not really. Siakam somewhat, Halliburton somewhat, but not like Mathurin. So no, and that's why exactly what I said. Why? Let's find out. 2 months into the season, 3 months into the season, trade deadline. They'll know way more about where they're at. And heck, they weren't out of the play-in game until the last day of the season, and then they make the Eastern Conference Finals. So it's just going to be wild to watch. Now it can go the other way too. Someone gets hurt, or maybe all these, maybe Giannis is healthy and Embiid is healthy, and the Knicks are way better, and all of a sudden, you're Orlando is much better. All of a sudden, you are the seventh best team in the East or the eighth best team. And you need to do something. But again, that's my point. They can do something if they feel like they need to, or if the right thing comes along. So
And to your point again, like 2 to 8 from the East in the East is really tight. It was in terms of record last year. It is in terms of talent. Like Boston has obviously the edge. Boston has a significant edge on everybody else. But from New York, Milwaukee, Indiana, Philly, Orlando, Cleveland, Miami, there's not a ton of separation there.
And I don't even mention Cleveland and Miami. Cleveland won a playoff series, and Miami is Miami, which goes to show you just how good and again, at some point, maybe one of those teams separates themselves from the rest. Maybe there's 2 tiers or whatever, but we don't know that yet. And it's crazy to try to force something now when you don't need to, especially after the season the Pacers just had.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, we appreciate you listening and or watching to the From Way Downtown Pacers podcast. Go to IndyStar.com for everything Dustin's done on the draft, and we'll have plenty more with free agency coming out. Well, we'll have plenty more if the Pacers do much. We'll have plenty more on the team in general as we go along here. So thank you for joining us.